Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 63 of Compliance Into the Weeds, a podcast where, with my good friend and colleague Matt Kelly, we take a deep dive into a compliance or compliance-related topic each week. Today, we have a very deep dive into an issue that Matt blogged about in a blog post entitled Fed's Eye Cybersecurity Risks of Tech Providers. The issue is that financial regulators have recently named cybersecurity as one of their top concerns going into 2018. And this really puts a lot of worry on third-party contractors supporting the financial systems. Yet, Matt and I believe that it will be compliance officers who really bear ameliorating or at least managing or attempting to manage this risk, this third-party risk going forward. While the initial alarm was raised by the Financial Stability Oversight Council, we both see this moving into the realm of the Chief Compliance Officer's program in 2018. And it also speaks towards the greater convergence of third-party risk in an organization, whether that be anti-corruption risk, supply chain risk, or cybersecurity risk. We believe that the compliance department of a corporation is uniquely suited to lead the efforts to manage these risks. It's a fascinating exploration. Definitely, we go into the weeds, and it will be a topic that we will consider going forward into 2018 as well. This is Tom Fox. Compliance Into the Weeds is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back again with my good friend and colleague Matt Kelly for another episode of Compliance Into the Weeds. Today, we're going to take a look at a blog post that Matt had earlier this week entitled Fed's Eye Cybersecurity Risks of Tech Providers. And if this blog post and this podcast don't scare the bejesus out of you, you're probably have very low blood pressure is all I have to say. So, Matt, it was a really interesting post, but more importantly, I think you raise a lot of very important issues for the compliance practitioner. So why don't we dive right into this and lay the groundwork?
Sure. So this is a report that came out last week. This is from the Financial Stability Oversight Council, also known as FSOC. And so for anybody who is not in the financial services or banking sector, what is this council? This was created by the Dodd-Frank Act, and basically it is the heads of all of the financial regulators in the United States. So the head of the Federal Reserve, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Treasury Secretary. I think there's probably about 8 or 9 members in total. The heads of them all gather, I believe, about once a quarter to coordinate financial regulatory policy and, in theory, help to anticipate and prevent another financial crisis like we saw in 2008, when we had regulators all dancing to their own different tunes, and we made a much worse mess of things back then. So this council, this is in charge. They are publish an annual report where they view the big risks to the financial sector overall. The report came out last week. The vast majority of it is going to be quite boring for most people who are not in banking or financial services, except for the issue number 1 that came up, which was the FSOC report said the single biggest threat to the financial sector in the United States, probably worldwide as well, is cybersecurity. And they are specifically worried about all of those tech vendors that provide support to the financial sector and the cybersecurity of those entities and businesses working with banks, insurers, everybody else. What's the cybersecurity there? Do we not know it? Could an instability there trickle through to the financial sector and cause all sorts of mischief? That's what this key takeaway of the report was. And like I said, it was clearly the single biggest worry that they had when they published their report last week.
So that's the broad overview. The thing that struck me, Matt, was two things. One, that it really in not your opening paragraph, but pretty early in your piece, you expressed surprise that a quote group of Republican regulators tell a Republican Congress that they might need more regulation, things are bad. So that tells me something scary is going on. But also, you correctly point out, I think the ability of this particular Congress to get anything done seems to be pretty low, and there's going to have to be a robust business response to this. And you lay out some of not only the challenges, but the proposed remedies, or at least some of the things that businesses can look at. And I guess the first thing I wanted to start off on, and it may be that we have to end up with this point as well, is how does a business really reach down to the fourth party, to subcontractors down the chain who are involved in their technological support or technological services and secure cybersecurity risks?
They do it with great difficulty, which I think is probably not news to a lot of compliance officers struggling with this. And what really jumped out at me about the report was that the regulators were basically saying, we don't necessarily know who these tech service providers are. And even if we do know them, we don't necessarily have any ability to regulate them and tell them what their cybersecurity standards should be. So just for some quick examples of who some of these tech service providers are, anybody who is using Salesforce to manage your customer service records or retention, technically they are a service provider. Oracle or other financial software applications that run on many, many businesses, they technically are service providers. Now, those guys, I'm not too worried about their cybersecurity because they're big and they know what their risks are. However, in theory, any cloud-based vendor that any of your employees are using are a tech service provider to you. We could go back to the Target breach back in 2013, where the HVAC system that Target used, the system that connected the HVAC guys to Target's payment operation, so they could send their invoices electronically. Well, that system was a tech service provider. I don't even know the name of that business now. Many, many businesses, many financial firms have huge numbers of tech service providers. And so trying to figure out who they are, trying to figure out what their standards are for cybersecurity, how their standards would then insulate you, the banking sector, or you, the listener in your company, you're worried about yours. But how do their standards insulate you from the risks you have? Well, a lot of companies don't know. There was a report earlier in September from the Ponemon Institute that found, I think, only about 57% of IT executives even knew how many vendors they had who were touching their confidential data. We're not getting into the boring data, Lord knows, but it was a really eye-opening report from the Ponemon Institute that supports what the FSOC was saying right here, is that we don't know who any of these tech vendors are. We don't know their standards. You have to have visibility into them. And as much as they might like some regulatory authority to stipulate what these standards are before you go supporting some of the biggest banks in the country, that's not going to happen. So it really does become incumbent on the company to understand who are my tech service vendors. And really, that's just another way of saying who are my IT vendors, my third parties, so that I understand my risks. And one of my points early on is that the better you are at your own third-party risk, you therefore become a more attractive third party to some other customer of yours. Because the customer isn't worried about its third parties. The customer is worried about its fourth parties, its fifth parties, and so forth down the line. That's what the FSOC people are worried about. Well, your providers, your vendors are your customers' fourth parties. You are the bridge. So if you can manage your third-party risks, and then you can go and court your customers saying, you don't have to worry about all these extended enterprise people. I got it under control. You become a more attractive third party. That is the business advantage. That is the business imperative of investing in third-party risk management and compliance. It's not about cutting costs. It's about making yourself a more attractive customer partner to the customer world at large.
So one of the things that I've tried to advocate over the past few years is that compliance is a business response to a legal problem. And I certainly saw that in the FCPA compliance space, where particularly in Houston, in the energy company, in the energy industry, there was a very concrete movement to require each of your vendors and agents in your channel ops chain to have a robust compliance program, and that it was the responsibility of your direct counterparty to have that program, and your responsibility was to audit it. And it moved all the way down the chain, literally from a $20 billion Halliburton down to a $15 million software company, simply because of the legal responsibilities and legal requirements the FCPA originally put on companies. But companies began to view that as a business requirement as well. And then it became what you've identified as a market differentiator, so that it makes you a more attractive as a third party. It makes you more attractive as a company. And it here in the cybersecurity space, it's going to make you not more attractive to other businesses, but to the consumer, to the consuming public world. And I really see that as a parallel that perhaps cybersecurity could draw on. But then let me tie it back into one thing I chastised you for. I can't remember if it was 2014 or 2015, but at Compliance Week conference where you chaired a panel on cybersecurity, and you said every compliance officer needs to listen to this. And Scott Moritz and I just rolled our eyes. Well, we quit rolling our eyes, Matt, and it was a very prescient panel. And but the points you raised in your blog post are around what this means for the compliance officer and why the compliance function is uniquely suited to bring this type of oversight. Could maybe you expound on that a little bit more?
Well, I think that the muscle memory of going through third-party oversight for what? Well, for really any risk, it carries through in many ways. Now, since you mentioned FCPA, we could easily say if you, mid-sized energy company, have a very good FCPA program, yes, you become a more attractive merger target, because the Halliburtons of the world, they're not going to want to buy you out and inherit some FCPA liability they never heard of, were never responsible for. So if you can demonstrate, I don't have those FCPA issues, so you won't inherit them, then you go to the short line in the M&A targets, and that's where you want to be as a business. Very similar dynamic to cybersecurity. It's not so much a legal problem; it's just a general risk problem. If you do not have good cybersecurity, you are easy prey for hackers, and they might not even be seeing you as the victim. You might be the vehicle for their real victim, who is Bank of America, JP Morgan, all the others, to launch some sort of gigantic attack. So JP Morgan, Bank of America, Citigroup, the rest, they know this. They worry about cybersecurity night and day. And many of them actually now have said that cybersecurity is the first criteria for doing business with them. If you do not meet their standards on cybersecurity, forget it. You're not going to work with them. Doesn't matter what your price is. Doesn't matter how cool the tech is. Doesn't matter that your uncle is the guy on the board or anything like that. Dead in the water if you don't meet cybersecurity. So compliance is a business response to this gigantic market risk that is only going up. And as we can see from the Poneman Institute and any other number of reports there, large organizations are still struggling mightily to get a handle on their third parties. They know the risk is out there. So you as a mid-sized company wanting to work with financial services, you certainly need to get your own third-party risk management in order. But even any of you listening out there who are at tech service providers, and a lot of them are privately held, a lot of them are in startup mode, a lot of them don't necessarily have a lot of public recognition, you too should be preparing yourself so that you can be the excellent fourth party for your customer who has this robust third-party oversight program, who's then going to go and say to Bank of America, you should work with us. Tech service providers and the smaller firms out there that want to crack into financial services, all of them have this compelling interest to make sure that your cybersecurity controls are in order, and you can demonstrate that and be a good partner for the third-party due diligence program that's going to come knocking before you get to sign the contract.
And now to the part where we really get to geek out into the weeds. You list some practical challenges with three really, I think, interesting points that we're going to take a deep dive into. But I would open this section by noting that even with the challenges you presented, it seems to me the compliance function is really uniquely suited to at least take a look at initially addressing them, really because of the reasons you just articulated. But why don't you really take us into the weeds on these three challenges you see?
Sure. So the three of them are, and I'll unpack them each in due course, but the three are setting out a proper SOC 2 audit. So there's lingo number one. Implementing the NIST protocols for cybersecurity. So that's piece of lingo number two. And then preparing for more regulatory scrutiny, which will come probably from the Securities and Exchange Commission, probably from the Fed, and probably from the PCAOB, trickling down through your audit firms. Even if Congress does not give them the real authority to inspect tech providers directly, we're still going to see more regulatory scrutiny that will trickle down anyways. So a SOC 2 audit, SOC, I think that stands for service-oriented company, but a SOC 2 audit is an audit you can have performed on a tech service provider. So the payroll processor, the data storage firm, the HR function that you're going to rent out, the automatic payment system that you use. A SOC 2 audit looks at their data security controls. There are two types. The first type, type 1, says it audits whether the controls are designed to meet the risks at hand. And type 2 is more extensive. It says the controls are designed and actually work the way they're supposed to for a set period of time. So really what you want as a company is to have your tech service providers give you a SOC 2 type 2 audit, probably from an audit firm that does this for a professional living. Now, the good news is that if you're a big customer, you can muscle this provider to pay for that audit to be done. That's the price of doing business with me, the nice big company. The bad news, the challenge for compliance officers is that this is your assurance. You need to tell the tech service provider what you want to inspect. You have to scope this audit correctly. We could talk for an hour about scoping the SOC 2 audit to your standards. But remember, if you don't scope in privacy controls, but you're handling PII, personally identifiable information, then you're not getting the risk assurance you need. But let's say that you do scope in something like nonstop data availability, but really you only need it from 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, but you're auditing to make sure it's around the clock. Well, now you have over-compliance, and you're paying for an audit for some assurance it's nice to have, but you probably don't need. A SOC audit can be too much, it can be too little, but you really want it just right, and it requires the compliance officer and probably the IT security person and probably the internal audit executive. Three of you have to sit down and figure out, how do we scope this correctly and give it to the tech service provider? And what is correct for one provider will not be correct for another one. This is not like some rubber stamp procedure. You've got to do it one step at a time or one vendor at a time. So that's the SOC 2 audit and how to scope it correctly. I think the second big thing that companies should think about is the NIST protocols. NIST stands for the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It's a government-run entity, and it just puts out standards. And it put out protocols for cybersecurity, especially in critical infrastructure, such as banking. And it puts them out and it updates them on a regular basis. And these controls are great. They are exacting and they are exhausting. If you implement the whole series of them, you will probably be working on this for a long, long time. But you can take those controls that make most sense for you. You can implement them in your own systems. This isn't a overly technical sort of list of controls. This is more an abstract level of, do you have a set number of password attempts before somebody is logged out? Do you have a password change policy that is commensurate to your risk. If you want to access the company's cafeteria menu, you don't need the password. If you want to update or view the company's financials, the password has to be changed every 30 days, that kind of thing. NIST is great, and banking is well aware, the IT security community within banking, they know NIST, and they're implementing NIST. You too should be implementing NIST. It's going to, I think, eventually be the good housekeeping seal of approval on IT security. You'll need to be able to demonstrate how you've implemented it, but having that would make your, for example, your SOC 2 audit much easier to go through. Once your customer shows up and saying, we want these controls and scope, you'll know what those controls are because NIST said these are the standard controls and the ones that fit your risk needs. It's very good, but it's still a journey for companies to get involved with the NIST protocols. And then lastly, like I said, the third, I think, is more regulatory scrutiny, particularly from the SEC and from your audit firm as directed by their regulator, the PCAOB. Securities and Exchange Commission already likes to talk a lot about cybersecurity. It says it wants more robust disclosure of cybersecurity risks and possibly even a cybersecurity event. What does that really mean? We don't know yet. The SEC, I think, does not know yet. They just know that they should answer that question. I could envision a world where, for example, the company has to file a Form 8K disclosure for every material cybersecurity breach. That would probably give your corporate secretary heartburn. It would probably give your IT security people heartburn as well, because 8Ks generally have to be filed, I think, within 3 days of an incident. So you'd have to know what the incident was and file it in a timely manner. And then on the audit side, this is going to be interesting because the PCAOB has told audit firms, ask your clients about their cybersecurity. Okay, good idea, but how exactly does a cybersecurity breach relate to a financial restatement, which is what your auditor is there to look for? Really, I'm not clear that it would. It could ultimately cost you a lot of money, but it doesn't lead to a restatement of anything. And that's what the audit firms are there for. So I think, again, this is an example of regulators know that they can't ignore cybersecurity, but they're not quite clear yet on how they're supposed to engage with the issue effectively. So you might have a discussion with your auditor about cybersecurity. You might well have never had that discussion before, and you might wonder, why the hell are we talking about this? Doesn't have anything to do with the key financial accounts and the material risk of misstatement. And but you're still going to have it anyways. I mean, because people don't quite know yet how to worry about cybersecurity effectively, even though everybody up and down the chain is worried about it up to their eyeballs.
So on the SEC part of your last remarks, Matt, I think one of the largest criticisms of the corporate response to cybersecurity breaches has really been this lack of notice to the public. And it would seem to me that would be something that it would be a quick, easy response by the SEC to require if not an 8K notice, something more robust than waiting months to make that information public. But I really wanted to ask, 8Ks only speak to material breaches. And would you have any idea of what might be a material breach, cybersecurity breach? Would it deal with damage to the company, damage to customer information, something else, or a combination of it?
Well, so do I have an idea of what a material breach would be? No. And that is exactly the problem. For example, what if you have 40 million customer names that get stolen? Well, is that material? I don't know. But what if you have only 10,000 out of those 40 million get hacked, but all of their financial information is stolen, all of their social security numbers, employment history, and everything else? Well, 10,000 isn't a lot of names and a lot of customer records when you have 40 or 100 million customer records in total, but it's material to the 10,000. So which one is material? Is Is it material enough on volume, even though the sensitivity of the data isn't really all that much? I mean, my name's out there in public, so's yours, big deal. We don't know that yet. What if the information is stolen but never used? And this is actually a case winding its way to the Supreme Court right now, is what constitutes harm in a data breach. There are several appellate circuits that have said the potential of future abuse counts as harm. There are other appellate circuits that have said if there's no harm, there's no harm. Doesn't matter that maybe there's going to be harm tomorrow. There's no harm today. You don't have standing today. Now, the Supreme Court is going to eventually hear that at some point, but we don't know what that answer is going to be like. And so I think this is the big part of the problem. And we all talk about customer names. What if your tech service provider provides the open door for hackers to steal that big promising molecule that you, the pharmaceutical company, you were going to bet the company on? Okay, that seems like it's material to me, but again, what if they only steal one but not 10? What if the molecule hasn't really been proven yet? We're just pretty bullish on it. Is it material? Is it not? Do you have a duty to the investors for that? You know, what are you exactly supposed to disclose? Are you supposed to point the finger to the tech provider? We have no idea what these answers really are, except the kind of mealy-mouthed language from the SEC that you should disclose material risks to cybersecurity. And that's pretty much where the guidance ends. Guidance is 6 years old. A lot has changed in the cybersecurity landscape since then. I think that the chairman, Jay Clayton, would like to update it. I think he should. But I'm in the same boat as probably him and a lot of other people. I don't know what that should therefore be updated to. We could certainly create a lot of paperwork, and it wouldn't necessarily add a lot of value. We could certainly do something like audit cybersecurity controls in the same way that audit firms audit financial controls. I think that would be a very good thing for companies to do, except for the part that it's going to cost a fortune. And most of the time, it probably won't tell you anything you don't already know. Most companies don't have a breach at any given time. And you could still wind up with a breach you hadn't anticipated. And where do we go from there? I know that this is going to peter out at the end of this podcast here with a lot of we don't knows, but it just underlines how difficult this problem is right now.
So I guess I wouldn't have said it's going to peter out, Matt. I would have kind of circled back to where I tried to start with about your thoughts on the unique position of the compliance function and the compliance practitioner to lead these efforts. Because many of the things that you have just articulated, particularly around the three practical challenges, I think are things we saw from anti-corruption compliance having to go through over the past 5 years, if not longer. Certainly, we would need the technical expertise of corporate security or corporate IT. Nevertheless, many of the things that you have suggested, I think, are directly done by anti-corruption compliance practitioners now. So if I go back to Mr. Moritz and I rolling our eyes back in 2014, like I said, we've certainly stopped now.
Well, it is true to say that compliance officers are really the bridge between the technology and the risk, and all of the outcomes that can happen there when the technology and the risks are not aligned properly. And it's a business problem in the same way that the FCPA was a business problem. It was driven by regulation, but okay, so what? The regulation forced the business problem upon you. Compliance officers became the ones to solve it. It's about policy. It's about procedure. It's about training employees. A lot of times, the key control you're going to have in cybersecurity is the employee being risk aware. A lot of the key words that you and I would talk about if we're going to get into the weeds, I suppose, of how to solve cybersecurity, same key words you and I used 5 or 10 years ago talking about anti-bribery. So you're right that this is something where the compliance officer could very easily be in the middle of it for a long, long, long time. And let's be honest, this is where you should be, because this is going to become a big strategic issue for companies, and compliance officers can really gain a lot by being involved in it.
So let me go into the veiled land of the future, Matt. This is going to be an ongoing story. Is this something that you anticipate radical compliance will be looking at and monitoring going into 2018?
Yes, I think so. I deal with a lot of vendors I'm talking to, a lot of customers I talk to, compliance officers. They're all worried about vendor risk. That's a polite way of saying tech service providers and cybersecurity screw ups they have. But vendor risk management is crucial. And there are a lot of vendors out there who, I should say, the tech service providers are doing their level best to make sure that they are well groomed in this area to do business with companies and to be ready when the compliance officer gives them a call. But this is going to be a big deal. And even on the regulatory front, I do think the SEC will publish some further thoughts and guidance about this in 2018. I don't know what form that might take. It might just be a speech. I think that they would like to have more substantive guidance. We'll see what the PCAOB talks about when it starts publishing results of inspections of audits, probably in about 10 months' time. Audits that happen early next spring that will look at cybersecurity. They will all get inspected, and then we'll see the results of that in next fall of 2018. We'll see it there. And crazier things have happened. Who knows? Congress might actually pass a law giving the regulators a stronger hand to take command of this issue. But yeah, this is going to be front and center for show me the future where cybersecurity becomes less of a concern. I'll put it that way.
So really interesting post, really interesting discussion, Matt. This is definitely one that's going to be both of our radars, and hopefully we can take a deep dive into the weeds on it going further or going into 2018. So thank you.
All right, Tom. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of Compliance Into the Weeds. If you have listened to this podcast on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate our podcast, as it would help in our rankings and also help get the word out about the only podcast that takes a deep dive into the weeds of a compliance-related GRC audit or risk topic around. Also, if you have any questions, you can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. You can email Matt at mkelly@radicalcompliance.com. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of Compliance Into the Weeds. This will be our final episode in 2017, so I wish you a very happy holidays into the new year, and I hope you'll join us in 2018, where we continue the only weekly exploration of Compliance Into the Weeds. Compliance Into the Weeds is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.